So now that we have models for consumer choice, demand, and elasticity, we can look at putting all of those things together into a very robust model of the market. We need one more thing in order to do that, and it's to think about the supply side of the market. That actually would be a whole class in and of itself, and so we'll make a few assumptions about supply just to give us something to model here. So as we think about supply, I'm going to model that as an upward sloping line. And really, I'm just saying that the relationship here is that as prices rise, producers will have an incentive to produce more. And as prices fall, producers will want to produce less. It's still that same relationship between price and quantity. Remember, demand is what? It's at a given price, how much are consumers willing and able to buy? Well, for the supply side, then the price is how much producers are willing to produce and offer for sale at that price. Now, there is a relationship here between the costs of production and the supply curve. And so what we're going to do is just say that there's this upward sloping supply curve. There's a relationship between prices and the profit motive. And we'll be able to use that to develop now a model for the market equilibrium. So let's take a look at what that looks like. As we think about a market, right, we have this price and quantity that we're going to describe, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about the demand curve and what that looks like, why it has the shape that it has. Elasticity tells us about, how steep or flat this curve is. But now let's add in the supply side. So as we have an upward sloping supply curve here, what we see is the point where these two things intersect. And as you sometimes see, this is called an equilibrium. Well, why is it called an equilibrium? Well, an equilibrium just means that something is in balance, right? Or it's at rest. So if you think about saying, oh, well, my equilibrium's off, what are you saying? You're saying, you can't walk quite straight, that you're not in balance. The other thing that this equilibrium point tells us is that the quantity at this price, right? So here's the price where those two are equal. The quantity on the demand curve is here, and the quantity on the supply curve is here. So the equilibrium is at that price, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And this is so important that it has a name, and again, not a very creative name, but it's called the market clearing price. And so this price that we have is going to clear the market, that everything producers produce, consumers will be willing and able to buy at that market price. And this is important for us, right? Imagine that it wasn't the case, right? What would happen if the price was a little bit higher? So something caused the price to be up here. Well, you'll notice at that price, the demand curve tells us how much consumers are willing and able to buy, and that's down here. And the supply curve tells us how much producers are willing to produce and offer for sale. And you'll notice this difference between these two, that the quantity supplied is bigger than the quantity demanded, and that's this distance between these 2 points. Well, if we supply more than is demanded, this is what we call a surplus. Right? There's extra in the market. And is that good or bad? Well, there's an opportunity cost here. If we're producing a product that consumers don't want at that price, then what we're saying is that all of the resources that went into that production, they're gone. We can't get those back. And so this represents a wasted opportunity for us. We could have produced something else. Now, those extra goods that were produced, what do we do with them? Well, we know from a downward sloping supply curve that one way to get rid of those extra units that have built up is to lower the price. And what we see then in this case where there's a surplus is it's going to put downward pressure on prices. And you can imagine a really simple example of that. So take a farmer's market. A farmer goes out, collects, say, 100 ears of corn. And he decides to price it at $1 per ear. and he puts a sign out and people drive by, and some people stop and say, oh, well, that looks like really good corn, so I'll buy some. But maybe he only sells 50 of them. Well, that poses a problem because corn doesn't last forever. So I need to be able to get rid of it. So then he goes out and crosses out the dollar and says 50 cents. And what that does is causes the quantity demanded to increase, right? We move to a higher quantity on that curve. It also has another impact, which says, oh, well, at that new lower price, right, the firm wants to actually produce a little bit less. And eventually we'll see that those 2 points come together at the market equilibrium. When a market is in surplus, those market forces are going to put this downward pressure on prices, which then helps consumers and producers reallocate resources. Now, a very similar story would happen if instead of talking about a surplus, what if we talked about a price that was below the market equilibrium? So here's that market equilibrium price that we had over here. Now imagine that the price is a little bit lower than that. Well, the point on the demand curve and the point on the supply curve, there's a distance between them. And this is what? This is the quantity demanded, and this is the quantity supplied. And you'll see that there's more demand than there is supply. This, on the other hand, is a shortage. So all that means is that there's not enough produced in the market to go to everyone who would actually want to buy it at that price. So what happens in this case? Well, you've all experienced something like this, whether it's a local sporting event where there's just not enough tickets to go around. Or maybe it's the demand for cronuts in New York City. That there's a limited supply, and at that price, people line up all around the corner. Well, if you go down and you count out how many are going to be made, you'll see that there's more people in line than there are cronuts available for them to buy. So inevitably, what's going to happen? Well, someone walks out with a bag with a bunch in it, and someone at the end of the line realizes, I'm not going to get one, so maybe I offer to pay that person a little bit more. And you'll notice that part of the demand curve here, right? So when we think about this demand curve, that this represents the willingness of a consumer to pay for the product. And so this was the price that was actually paid. And this point on the demand curve represents someone who would be willing to pay more than that. But you'll notice that point on the demand curve also represents someone who didn't actually get the product, because there's only this much produced and there's demand out here. So there's an opportunity now for individuals in the market who receive that scarce output to be able to resell it. Now, in my sports example, that would be, say, something like a scalper. In this case, that means that there's an incentive for an individual who gets one to actually sell it to someone else. So this shortage then is definitely bad. It's a missed opportunity. That there's benefit that someone could have received from producing more of this product. Well, how do we convince producers to produce more? Well, if we want to move to a higher quantity on the supply curve, we need to increase the price. And in this case, there's now an upward pressure on prices. And you'll notice both of these cases, when there's a surplus, there's downward pressure on prices in order to increase demand and decrease supply. When there's a shortage, there's upward pressure on prices, and that's going to decrease demand and increase supply. In both of those cases, the market force is pushing us right back to this market clearing price, where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. Now, this is so important that this idea that market forces push us to this point, right? This point is an efficient allocation. In fact, it's called allocative efficiency. So what would that mean? So this is allocative efficiency. It's asking us how society allocates resources. Right? So there's this product for, say, cronuts over here. There might be another product for just regular donuts. There's a product for bagels. all of these different markets are using the scarce resources that we have available. Right? There's some flour that goes to producing a bagel. There's some flour that goes to producing apple pies. And the question for society is, well, how many apple pies? How many bagels? How many, right? That's the question that we really want to answer. And so allocative efficiency is really this idea that we allocate the right amount of resources to producing a particular good. Well, what does that mean? It means that consumers are receiving some benefit from consumption. And so as they receive that benefit from consumption, right, that's captured by this demand curve here. And if you remember thinking back to our consumer choice model, this demand curve is what? It's the benefit, it's the utility that we're deriving from that. And so the big question is, or the problem that we face is when there's a shortage, right, there's some utility that we missed out on. Whereas when there's a surplus, right, that we're sort of overproducing, we're producing too much. And so that necessarily means that those resources didn't go somewhere else. So we want to try to get to this equilibrium point. And the good news is, all else equal, market forces are going to push us in that direction.